So thank you for that delicious lunch. Whoever organised it was wonderful. And I thought in our post-lunch relaxation, we'll just watch a film. Unfortunately, it's a short extract of a film rather than the whole thing. What I want to do is to explore some of the ideas that we've been talking about through the use of an extract of a film. And we saw in Paul's paper yesterday that, and I'm quoting here from the paper, that difference pervades our lives not as something static, but as something ceaselessly developing and unfolding. And these differences are positioned and shaped through a continuing processes of mutual recognition. So in this presentation, I want to explore these by looking at 7 or 8 minute extract of a 1976 film by the British director Nicholas Roeg. This is The Man Who Fell to Earth. Has anyone seen the film, The Man Who Fell to Earth? It's an interesting film. So in my reading of this particular extract, I want to highlight the distinction between interior and exterior. Okay, so that's what I'm interested in looking at. As portrayed in the film, and as characterised by Gilles Deleuze, is it Gilles or Gilles? Gilles Deleuze, in his book The Fold, which he wrote in the 1980s. And in this book he engages with the work of Leibniz, the German polymath, mathematician, philosopher. And he draws it out in this book, Le Pli, or The Fold, a detailed account of this ceaselessly developing and unfolding through an engagement with the Baroque and this idea of the Baroque, which I'll explain later.
Baroque?
Baroque, yeah. So it's a period in European history. So I want to look at this, how this film highlights the case of a particular case of the outsider. So one that can be considered a near insider. So for someone for whom there's a degree of recognition is afforded. And that will allow us to look at some potentially interesting things, I hope. So to get you up to speed to this scene in the film, this is about halfway through the film. This is based on a 1963 book a novel by Walter Tevis. And in this book, and in the film, the key protagonist is an alien, Thomas Jerome Newton. It's played by the late David Bowie. And he feels very much an outsider in his dealings with the people of the earth to which he has fallen. And indeed, he is an alien in the interplanetary sense. He's a visitor on a mission to save his family from the ravages of a drought on his home planet. So that's why he's here. He's convincingly disguised as a human being, although he does look like David Bowie in 1976. And he's able to pass himself off as an insider, and through his technical knowledge and capabilities, he's able to amass a great deal of wealth. Okay, so he becomes a very, very wealthy billionaire, and his power then enables him to initiate a private space project, a space program in which he intends to bring water to his home planet. And crucial to the success of this space program is a scientist, Dr. Nathan Bryce, played by the actor Rip Torn. He's a disillusioned former college professor whom Newton has employed to help devise a means of conserving energy. Okay. So at Newton's command, he's summoned Bryce to Newton's own residence, a private residence in the American West, on a lake. So this is where we start the film. And he's kept Bryce waiting for several days in a guest house. And Bryce has filled in his time drinking and fishing. And he's never met Newton before, and he's looking forward to this meeting. And so we start the film at that particular point. What I'll do is I'll just play the film, and I've got a short summary of the things that we're about to see, but I won't hand these out until we've seen the extract, so you can concentrate on the film itself. Okay. So In The Fold, this book by Gilles Deleuze, he presents an allegory that seeks, amongst other things, to understand the relationship of interior and exterior in terms of the Baroque. And the Baroque here refers to a movement in art and architecture in the early and through the 17th century in Europe. And it's known for its bold, direct style and its use of, to modern taste, of often excessive detail. In architecture, it's characterised by a grand facade that opens into a series of cavernous chambers that lead into successively smaller and more intimate spaces. So taking the innovations of Leibniz as his starting point, Deleuze characterises the Baroque as a house with two levels. It has a lower level and an upper level. And these levels correspond to what engages with the material, the external and the sensory, and that's the lower level. And that which leads up and into an internal space. This is the upper level, corresponding with the soul. And he uses Leibniz's term, the monad, which is sealed from the outside and self-contained. And notice here, we've already got a distinction. He's not making a distinction between outside and inside. He's making the distinction between upper and lower levels. And the world, in this conception, is already in. It's already on the inside. These levels, upper and lower, the world and the soul, intersect through an infinite series of folds. One inside the other, or caverns within caverns, as Deleuze puts it. So in viewing our world this way, what he's seeking to do, amongst other aims, is to reconcile the closed-off internal realm of the mind and subjectivity with the open external realm of materiality in the world. And he sees both inside and outside in a state of continuous interplay. And as with so much of Deleuze's work, there's a great deal more to it than this. But what I want to focus on is this allegorical image, if you like, of this image of the house with its two levels, because I think it's a useful tool for understanding what's going on in this scene and the anxieties of the man who fell to earth. So in Thomas Jerome Newton, we have the ultimate outsider. You see, he's a non-human alien from another planet who, through the possession of certain qualities, can pass himself off as human. And near enough simulations of the insider culture. In this case, it's America in the 1970s. His physical differences can be concealed with a wig and contact lenses, and his odd behaviours, his quirks and idiosyncrasies, are passed off as Englishness. And this is a culture that's known in the United States for its eccentricities. So rather than being an alien, he's simply English. It helps that he's intelligent and articulate, and that through his ingenuity and alien knowledge, he's able to lodge a number of original patents. So he's using the alien technology, he's patented a whole lot of alien technology. Those technologies are then sold, and that's how he becomes very wealthy. Thus, as a multi-billionaire with a plausible enough backstory, he is able to move through humanity relatively unimpeded, and he's what I'd like to characterise as the inside outsider. So he's inside out. But his insiderness is superficial. It's a front, it's a facade. Through his wealth, in particular, he's able to isolate himself in order to avoid discovery. And he plays into an accepted American archetype of the reclusive billionaire. And this is perhaps a cliché that matches Bryce's own disillusioned scientist. And thus, Newton is able to orchestrate his meeting with Bryce through intermediaries. He has mastery of the exteriors. He mobilises his power across distances, the desert, the country, the planet, the whole solar system. And we see the folds or layers of this external lower realm over which Newton has dominion in Bryce's journey. From the limbo of the guest house where he's waiting, to the boat across the lake, from the lake along the jetty and into an incongruous landscape that meshes east and west. From there into the limousine where Bryce first meets Newton, and thence to the facility, culminating with the sphere of light that illuminates Newton's innermost sanctum. So we can see this as a journey of folding over across the lake and then folding into the limousine, and then the limousine into this space. But it's when Bryce and Newton are brought together in the confines of an interior space, this capsule that Newton has built, and they're permitted a longer, unmediated exchange, that Newton's capacity to maintain his illusion as an insider is strained to breaking point. The interior space here is one that enforces physical proximity and obliges interaction in isolation. And for all of his externally mobilized wealth and power, Newton is vulnerable on this inside, even though it's one that he's contrived himself. In a sense, Bryce has been brought inside Newton's soul, but it's no longer a monad, a whole that's indivisible. The very presence of Bryce dissolves this construct that Newton has created. So this slippage, this breaking down or unfolding of the layers, and here, to use Deleuze's term, the unfolding is not the opposite of a fold, it's the continuation of that process. This unfolding that breaks down the layers to protect Newton's constructed self, it's initiated really when the phantom visitation of the night before is perhaps unconsciously alluded to, where he says, "Don't be suspicious," which is something that they've exchanged before. The phrase's halting, knowing repetition and the memory that it evokes simultaneously in both of them changes the dynamic of the encounter. Although Bryce cannot perhaps fully understand his growing suspicion of Newton, he senses it intuitively. It seems that he doubts their encounter by the lake really took place. "I think we've met before," he says when he climbs into the limousine, and it's uncertainty that Newton doesn't reciprocate. But as a scientist, he can only accept the idea that Newton was really there, though his apparent vanishing does seem to trouble him. There is something inexplicable about Newton, and therefore something beyond reason, open only to intuition. In this interior space, the space capsule, there is a concentration of their essences, if you like. It acts as a crucible or a catalyst for transformation. The indivisible begins to divide, and the impossible can be contemplated. The interiority of the space is highlighted in their exchange. Bryce insists that the capsule is too small for interplanetary travel. And Newton later asks if he'd be comfortable in here, to which Bryce responds that he would scream after about 20 minutes. "Wouldn't anyone," he says. He then discusses a television program he saw the night before that depicted former astronauts as mentally unstable. The subtext to the viewer is that Newton does indeed intend to undertake this travel in this claustrophobic space, and is able to occupy such a space in a way that any other human being would not. And it's clear here, and in other parts of the film, that Newton has obtained much of his understanding of human society through television broadcasts. And in this scene it becomes clear that this exterior representation of humanity has failed to provide a full account. Television is, after all, simply waves in space, and cannot fully convey the rich interior world of the human. Bryce further calls attention to their differences when he depicts himself as the disillusioned scientist, a cliché alongside other clichés. Although this is perhaps an overt reference to Newton's exceptional wealth, Bryce's comparative ordinariness, there's a sharpness to the way Bryce speaks to him. "A man like you wouldn't understand a guy like me." This is perhaps intended to explain to Newton why Bryce cannot fully trust him. He's experienced disillusion too often to trust anyone. But really, it's an enunciated declaration of his difference from Newton, of his humanity. Newton can only respond with, "I'll try to, Dr. Bryce, I'll try to understand you." And here we have an acknowledgement from Newton, the outsider, that he cannot. He simply doesn't have the capacity to understand Newton's world, and he must remain on the outside. Their final exchange drives home Bryce's growing suspicion of Newton, who, having reassured him that he is English and not Lithuanian — remember, this is filmed during the Cold War, and Lithuania was part of the Soviet bloc. But Newton's unable to recognise a Latin phrase that Bryce expects would be recognised by any educated Englishman, the man that Newton purports to be. Indeed, Newton even indicates that he's not really aware of what Latin is. You see him trail off. He says, "Latin?" Clearly a shortcoming of getting to know humanity through television. There's not a great deal of Latin programming around. Newton's lack of a rich and detailed understanding of the insider culture, folds that extend infinitely inwards, has been exposed. And Bryce, by the end of the exchange, has attained the upper hand. It is now Bryce, whose humanity is beyond question, who wields the power between the two. And this represents a full reversal, given their relative status at the start of the exchange. When Newton's command of the external world gave him all the overt power in the relationship, with Bryce as the outsider, brought within. But Bryce's command of the interior realm of humanity makes out that he is the true insider and has exposed the outsider's pretense. So what I'd say is that this pivotal sequence in the film, it arguably represents a nightmare scenario for near insiders, those who are seeking to fully assimilate into the insider's world and who otherwise would be regarded as insiders. Newton needs Bryce. This is the thing. He needs him to fulfill his mission. And he uses his wealth and his influence, these externalities, to summon his presence. And he's lured there by Newton's knowledge. In the intimate setting of the space capsule, however, Newton's influence over Bryce weakens, and it's Bryce's flaws and his moral stance, his humanity, which affords him the ascendancy over the alien Newton. So Newton's inside-outsider, a near insider, at least in the material domain, holds dominion over the exteriors of the culture, the lower level of Deleuze's Baroque house, the realm of the senses that can be fooled. His mastery is over the machinery of the society, that he can operate at a distance, isolating himself from an intimacy that may unmask him. Should he permit entry to that upper floor, the innermost sanctum, however, then his strategies of distancing will no longer apply and his true self will be revealed. Over the course of the film, Newton does reveal his true alien self to others with disastrous consequences. So long as his interior domain is kept at some distance removed from the others and sealed, he is able to function within his adopted society as an inside-outsider. This strategy of isolation, of avoiding intimacy in order to mask inauthenticity, may serve a functional purpose, but it is this deliberate distancing and disassociating from others that drives and compounds an inner sense of alienation, of not belonging within himself, and which drives and compounds a sense of suspicion and even hostility towards him from the true insiders. So in this sense, Newton's strategy of isolation does not truly protect him, but rather it performs and reaffirms his difference. In the film, Newton is tolerated but not respected by others. People are content enough to take his money and do his bidding, but he is widely seen as an oddity, a freak, inauthentic. To an American, his being English is perhaps explanation enough. Now, he is an alien, Newton, in the film, and let us not forget that his character has an agenda and an ulterior motive, things he cannot reveal for fear of discovery. But this particular dramatic representation nevertheless sheds light on all of us who may wish to live alongside others whose cultures and shared experiences we ourselves do not share, even as those others are not aware of this, the inside-outsider. So that's what I wanted to say, but I have some questions that I hope we can discuss, and perhaps you may have some questions as well. So some questions to you. If the sense of otherness is held within the outsider, in their soul, in this conception, to what extent is it the gift of the insider to offer inclusion? And to what extent is this attainment of inclusion the sole responsibility or the primary responsibility of the outsider themselves? The second question, I suppose, is if we accept that it is the intimate interior setting that weakens the outsider's position by threatening to reveal their inauthenticity, to what extent does the outsider's spurning of intimacy and opening themselves up to others in turn drive them further apart from the insider? And how could this pattern be arrested. So those are the two provocations that I want to give, but you may have other things that you wish to say as well.
Could you repeat them?
Yes, yes.
You want to write them?
Yeah, I should really. So if the sense of otherness is something that comes from outside of the outsider themselves, in their soul, it's held within the insider, to what extent is it the gift of the outsider to offer inclusion? So if we think of our societies and migration, for example, we wish to include others, and we may offer open arms and open houses to come in and sit down and eat with us. But to what extent is it the insider's gift to do that? Is it something that can be offered and taken up simply like that?
So, excuse me, so when you say insider, insider of the existing community?
Yes, exactly. The insider of the existing community.
So those who accept, receive?
Yes, so if an insider is inclusive,
Yeah.
Is that enough for the outsider to feel included? Or is there something within the outsider that also has to change?
Wow.
The second part really is my hypothesis, I suppose, that if we accept that it's the interior setting, the opening up, that weakens an outsider's position by threatening to reveal their inauthenticity, then to what extent does the outsider's spurning of intimacy, avoidance of this risk, to what extent does that then reaffirm their difference? So in this instance, Newton invites Bryce, because he needs him, right into this sort of central space, sort of symbolic space representing Newton's own soul. It's what he's trying to do. But because of that intimacy, that they are forced into proximity, and he just cannot maintain the facade, he cannot maintain the distance. He's revealed as a fake, in effect. So I'm wondering to what extent other inside-outsiders, people who are accepted for the most part, to what extent they do seal themselves off a little bit from others in order to not appear inauthentic. And I should say that in my own experience, the way I came to this, many of you have heard this story, so forgive me for repeating it, but the reason I chose this particular extract and these particular themes is because this is my experience of anxiety and inclusion. Because I am British and I was born in England and I have English children and an English mortgage and an English house and an English job, but I don't feel English. I'm Australian, that's how I feel. Although if I go back to Australia, I feel different again, which comes back to Kassan's question of when do we ever feel at home. But that's another matter.
How many years have you been in Australia?
I lived in Australia for about 18 years.
18?
18.
From the age of about 10?
No, from 14 to whenever that takes it, early 30s. And 10 years now in England. Cumulatively, I've now lived longer in England than I have in Australia. So in pure metric terms, I'm more English than Australian.
So your term inside outsider
Yeah.
is someone who seems to be inside of a certain community, but yet within oneself who keeps the space distance.
Yes, yeah. Where an inside-outsider wishes to... there's always a risk at the heart of any connection with others. Because what happens is that you risk a sense of inauthenticity. I don't get cultural references, a lot of English cultural references. So people will refer to popular culture of the 80s and 90s, the period when I wasn't in England. They'll put on a funny voice or say some sort of catchphrase from a comedy program, and everyone will laugh, but I won't get the joke. But if I reveal that I won't get the joke, then everybody focuses on me and focuses on the difference. So I don't say anything, ha ha ha, laugh along. But I don't understand. But no one would suspect that that's my experience, because I sound English, I look English, and I've got all the affectations of the English. So this is what I mean about the spurning of intimacy. You avoid situations or opening up so as not to put attention on oneself. Yeah.
Just I found interesting what you said, because as you said, you've been living in an English-speaking world for your entire life.
Yes.
And you are living in England now. You look like an English person.
Thank you.
You have a mortgages in English. But then, if you transfer that to the migrant, that sometimes you have live in a certain country, second or third generations of a certain ethnic group that's not similar to the natives. And although they speak fluently, they know the jokes because they were born in that country, they may not look like the others. So this difference, they only identify on you when you don't laugh at the same jokes, when you miss certain things that they think that is a shared thing, because you look so familiar in terms of aesthetically, that then they just found out when you are not able to accompany because you were not brought up in that culture. So I'm just wondering if there is an aesthetical dimension in that thing of inclusive, when the other may have much more familiarity of being brought in that culture, being born there, but physically is something that's identified straight away that we are not a member of the wider society.
Yes, I mean, I've had experiences where I've been with British Asian people, and other white British people have treated my British Asian friend as the foreigner, but they've grown up all their lives in Britain, and I haven't. So it's sort of what I was really interested by this is that there's my experience is a marginal case, if you like. It's at the edges of what constitutes an inside and outside experience in some ways. But it's at the same time, because the difference in kind is great to a migrant who doesn't speak the language, who looks different, has different cultural experiences, comes into a community and is very much alienated by that community. In my case, that doesn't happen, and yet there is still a sense of difference. I think perhaps it goes back to what we were talking about, the point that was raised in our discussion earlier about equivocity and univocity. That even within the smallest unit, there is a sense of alienation. The other example that springs to mind is particularly previously in British society, and thinking in the 60s and 50s and before, where homosexuality was prescribed. People would be able to pass themselves off as straight, simply because they don't look gay or effeminate, or all of these kind of cliches. Stereotypes. So that's another example of an inside-outsider, someone who looks just like you and me, but isn't, in a sense. So, does anyone else have anything to say about? What did you think of the film? Doesn't David Bowie look great? Bit too thin, yeah.
His eye hair at that time was awful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, his hair in particular is very at odds with the way everybody else looks in the film. So he has an alien quality about him. So there is something about him that's sort of unnerving, but he can pass himself off. I think this idea of passing oneself off is an interesting one too, because there's a motivation there, isn't there, of wanting to be. Now he has good reason, he's an alien from space, but to pass oneself off, why would one want to do so? Why not revel in difference? Particularly if you're on the inside in every other respect.
How how strictly can we hold up this kind of dichotomy between insider and outsider? Because I'm just thinking, I mean, don't we all experience this in a variety of ways? Because we're all sort of intersectional in a way, I think. We're not ever one thing. So there's always a sense of being both inside a situation and outside. And can we always identify what's outside and what's inside? Is it always that sort of easy to do?
I think you're right. And I think that what this case, what this illustration highlights is that very nature, the equivocal nature of being or becoming in that sense. So I think you're absolutely right. I think this is something that all of us have experienced in some way, at some time. The same kind, maybe differences in degree.
So how do we know then, in terms of the responsibility that you mentioned, whose responsibility is it to include, or is there something that the outsider needs to change? I'm getting confused about the terms. I mean, how do we identify responsibility and who's responsible for what if we can't identify?
Well, I think this comes back to my bringing in Deleuze here. This is a process that is continually being undertaken. It's the sort of the breathing of reality, as it were. In Nietzschean terms, I suppose, if you're always waiting for others to include you, you sort of become reactive in that sense. You blame others for not including you. So in that respect, there's something of action that's required on the part of the outsider, to act one's reaction, to sort of, and it's not to make an effort to assimilate. That's far too simplistic. But to realise that it's not simply, what I was fishing for, I suppose, is it's not simply the gift of other people to confer acceptance upon you. Because even if they confer it, you may not still really feel it. It's that something that you have to do.
That could get very dangerous, though, that idea. If we think about marginalised people and it can get to a sort of a level of almost victim blaming or victim, putting the responsibilities on the victims.
We could conclude that we shouldn't try to accommodate anybody or include anybody. It's up to them.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that that's the conclusion I want to reach.
Do you have, from Deleuzean perspective, do you have any response to your first question? Your first question is like, what was your first question? What can insider, outsider can offer to the insider? Insider?
The sense of inclusion being the responsibility to some extent. That's kind of what Alice and I were talking about.
Yes, but you said that it is difficult to draw the clear line between inside and outside. And outside can, from Deleuzean perspective, outside can anytime become inside. And we are talking about the Möbius strip.
Yes, the Möbius strip. Yeah. I mean, what Deleuze sort of takes from Leibniz is this idea that although he uses the term monad, which is, if you like, a singularity, the smallest or simplest level of perceptual reality. And it's a concept that I struggle with, to be honest. But I think what he would say there is that these monads, these moments of thingness, are being created and dissolved all the time, and they're being negotiated perpetually. I think the point I wanted to make with the inside-outsider is that if they simply wait for acceptance, if they simply hope that something happens from without, then that will never happen in the way that they expect. I think there has to be a degree of engagement with the world in order to feel part of it.
To be receptive to what is going on?
Receptive.
It looks like, in contrast to Adrian's presentation this morning, your point is more like active commitment or acting well to risk ostracization. Whereas I think your mode of thinking is rather more sort of immerse yourself to something strange beyond your own will. And probably that would, I think my question is, how can that moment of transformation can take place?
How can it take place?
Yes, because I think what you're saying is more sort of radical in a way, that this kind of Deleuzian destruction of the clear borderline between inside and outside will take place in some way.
Yeah, I think it's always happening. That's I think the point, that there isn't a concealment, a sealing off of the inside and the outside that's broken down by certain acts or actions. I think there's a continual. This is why they talks about caverns within caverns. So the spaces themselves contain spaces, and there's lots of talking. It's really interesting actually when he's speaking about this and using this kind of visual language to try and get to what he's saying. He talks about the interiors being kind of spongy, like the spongy caverns, with tiny little mirrors reflecting the light, and that's exactly the image that's used in the film, with the central sphere of light. And in the book, this, I think it's Nietzsche he draws it from, is the central light of reason. This is what the light represents. But the awareness of being an inside-outsider is merely a moment, if you like. I think, as Alison was sort of intimating, that this happens to all of us at all the time. You can think of it as a whole. You can think of it as a monad, as a thing, but you can think of it in other terms as well. So it's we're not stuck in it. We're continually able to move out of it if we desire, potentially.
I thought of two contrasts that I think are in the territory of what you're talking about when you were talking about yourself, and you're very articulate about your own position or where you find yourself in life now. But one contrast would be between recognition and hospitality or acceptance. Mm-hmm. Hospitality, as it's worked through by Derrida, for example. And in recognition, in the politics of recognition very often, there's a desire to name something, have it specified, have it articulated very precisely. I got the impression from what you were saying about yourself that you didn't really want that to happen, because as soon as it's all spelled out, the focus is on you, yes, and it's disrupted the whole social relationship, and in a sense misidentified you, misrecognized you. Whereas hospitality is a kind of unconditional giving of food, welcome, shelter and so on, without wondering who someone is or what ethnic group they come from or what language they speak or anything like that. So with that contrast, the hospitality thing seems to work more closely with what you're after. The other contrast, which is related, is between confession, as in the TV confessional. Oprah Winfrey, do you know who Oprah Winfrey is in Japan or not? You don't know Oprah Winfrey? Right, so this is a tremendously successful black American TV chat show host who does confessional discussions with people and has them say extraordinary things about their lives to millions of people. But that kind of confession, which of course is very much part of our age in the culture of therapy, contrasts with what in French they call pudeur. Pudeur is the opposite of impudence, but pudeur is a kind of restraint, a kind of holding back. I've been told that it's a bit like hatsugashi in Japanese. Hatsugashi. Yes. So this is, this restraint thing, this not seeking to articulate things, holding back from things, which seems to be more, it seems to open a social space, or a space to be, whereas the confessional doesn't. It kind of fixes people. So the more restrained option in each of these cases, hospitality or pudeur, as I said, goes with a Deleuzian monad that allows something to come into being and then to dissolve. He likes the word dissolve in relation to identity. It's the opposite of identitarian thinking in Adorno's terms.
Okay.
I don't know if that seems to relate.
It does. I think in this particular film, what we see on the screen here is the moment when Bryce refuses to recognise Newton through the Latin terminology. What you don't see, of course, is in the next scene. What Bryce does is he sets up an X-ray machine in his house to take an X-ray photograph of Newton to see if he's really human. So he suspects this thing because some of the technologies he's introduced have been quite wondrous. So at this point he's beginning to suspect that he's not all that he seems. But you see the look on his face, he's now downcast. He's no longer the insider in this situation. He has become the outsider through a lack of recognition, if you like. Bryce engages with him but doesn't recognise what he gets back. In terms of confession and aloofness, I think in my own experience that there's a social interplay that unfolds itself and goes on. And as you rightly say, to reveal that you don't understand something is to break the rhythm of that moment and to become to signal that I am different or special, because it's not a bad thing socially to have lived in lots of different countries. People will, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me about Australia or something like that, which is a very good thing. This is a contrast as well that you drew out, Marinette, about the migrants' experience, which is very different. At the same time, to remain aloof all the time is not to be able to be genuine about your own feelings about the situation. So although it allows the sociability to continue, to remain aloof to go along with things and to not reveal what's going on, that builds up a sense of loneliness, if you like, or alienation or disconnectedness from a place. You can't truly feel at home because you're hiding something, you're concealing something, which goes back to Alison's point of when, and Cassan's point, when are we ever truly at home? Aren't we always hiding something so as not to break a particular sequence?
Well, sorry, could I just say, whether or not something's been hidden depends partly on how far there's an expectation that people should let it all hang out, how far they should be expected to be upfront and open about everything.
Yeah.
Sorry, Naka.
Yeah.
I thought what you have just mentioned is related to what we read on the first day, explicit difference, like explicit and implicit.
Yes. To make it explicit is to change the dynamic. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that it was Latin that tripped him up. Latin came up in our conversation this morning, didn't it? In terms of language, and certainly in the British culture, Latin, knowledge of Latin, perhaps at the time the film was made, had sort of lost some of the cultural capital that it had once had, but which it now seems to have again. So, for example, in like the new free schools that have been set up in Britain, there's been a move towards having Latin on the curriculum, as if by not having it, there's something important is lost. What you'd also get now, I don't know whether you've noticed it, but certainly in Britain, the current sort of crop of politicians love to drop into the conversation that they've been classically educated. the Boris Johnsons and people like that. It's interesting that it's that
It's
which
an enunciation of difference there, isn't it?
yeah, but also it's a very strong sense of what it is to be an insider of a particular kind.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, one of the points that I made in the discussion there was that Newton's got all of his knowledge of human culture from television broadcasts, and Latin isn't. It's a form of very much an insider language and form of exchange that he's simply just unaware of, and he doesn't even know what Latin is, because in the popular culture of the 70s, it's not included in those broadcasts. So he simply doesn't know it, and it's like in England in particular. I don't know if anyone at the Japanese audience know this, that a lot of place names are pronounced a particular way that are only really known to those people who live there. And when someone comes in and pronounces a name incorrectly, they're automatically, you know that they're an outsider. A little bell goes off. Another, probably the classic example of that is Magdalen College in Oxford, which is spelt Magdalene. And if you call it Magdalen College, you're clearly not an educated person. So there are lots of linguistic traps in English that seek to catch people out, and you've got to be able to negotiate them. I have trouble pronouncing a lot of these Leibniz, Gil, Gilles. I don't know how they're pronounced because I tend to just read about them rather than drop them into conversation like Boris Johnson does. But the use of particular forms of language and particular sub-languages is a very clear way of dividing and showcasing, peacock-like, your difference from others.
So I think we should join. So thank you very much.
Thank you.